Hey Wargamers, welcome back to the channel, Death from Above Wargaming. I'm Aaron and we're back again with another awesome mech review. Tonight we've got the Black Knight BL-7-KNT, and this was a recommendation by one of our subscribers, the Mecha Man, Tucker O'Donnell. So thank you for this awesome recommendation. Black Knight is an iconic mech, 75-ton inner sphere design, and it just packs a ton of energy weapons. It has solid armor, decent mobility, but doesn't have the heat sinks to really deliver a killing blow. So let's take it into the Battlytics engine, we'll run it through some simulations, and we'll see how this thing stacks up to the rest. So stay tuned guys, that is coming right up. Alright guys, let's kick off the Black Knight review. So again, we're looking at the BL-7-KNT variant of this chassis. So the chassis is 75 tons, so an inner sphere heavy mech, and it is a battle value of 1,443. So it's not cheap, but it's pretty much on par with mechs like the Marauder and the Zeus, so it's right in there for that 75-80 ton range. So a little history lesson on this mech. So this is not the original sort of iteration of this mech. This is a refit with the less spectacular Succession Wars era technology. The original Black Knight was fitted with all sorts of advanced tech, which was then later rediscovered and refitted back onto the chassis. But this one, the BL-7, really is your base Succession War era's technology, right? So diving into the specs here, movement profile, so it's a 4.6, does not have any jump capabilities. It's packing 20 heat sinks, so obviously we all know this thing's got a very energy intensive loadout, which means a lot of heat, so it's packing 20 heat sinks. May not be enough though. Engine, gyro, cockpit, all of these things are standard for, again, this Succession Wars era chassis. Armor factor 176, so that translates into 11 tons or 76.2% total coverage. Looking at the center diagram there, the first thing that jumps out, everything looks pretty good except for the CT and the legs. They look a little bit under armored at first glance. We'll dive a little deeper into that when we get to the defensive benchmarking. This mech is equipped with hand actuators, so you can get in there and punch if you so desire. Weapon-wise, again, just an arsenal of energy weapons. 1 PPC, a pair of large lasers, 4 medium lasers, and a small laser mounted on the head. So this mech will have no shortage of weapons at any point in time. If you miraculously are able to destroy all the weapons on this mech without actually killing it, that's some crazy rolling you've got going on there. So diving into the offensive benchmarks for this mech. So let's start in the top left of your screen. So we're looking here at our baseline average calculated damage in conjunction with our red line average calculated damage. So the red line is basically where we alpha strike or fire basically as much as we can and get up to 29 heat but do not exceed 29 heat. The baseline, again, not exceeding 4 heat. So even with just not exceeding that 4 heat the entire game, this thing does a ton of damage. And what we immediately notice is this mech does exceedingly more damage the closer you get, right? So this mech is really good when you get in to that sort of 6-inch range when those medium lasers are at medium range basically, and so you can bring a lot of firepower to bear at that point. But at the same time, this mech can heat up incredibly fast at that range, right? So you've got the large lasers, you've got the PPC, you've got 4 mediums. These things, even at the furthest ranges out, just firing the PPC and the 2 large, you can spike your heat up pretty quickly. In just about 4 turns, you can shut this mech down if you try. So definitely be careful on the heat. Now, in terms of the optimization of this mech, so when you see a lot of heat, again, that means you can push the mech, try to get more damage output out of it. The challenge with this mech is heat saturation and utilizing those heat sinks efficiently. At further ranges, like at the PPC large laser range, it's really hard to work in an extra large laser because it just builds up so much more heat, another 8 points of heat, really makes it difficult to kind of work those things in together. So as you can see, we really can't push the mech too hard until those medium lasers come into play, because they're 3 heat a pop, and you can kind of work that into the rotation a little bit easier. But as you're doing that, if you notice, you're bringing that heat spike up. You have to spend a turn to cool off, and that's when that blue line dips below the baseline, back up again, back down again, back up again. So even though this mech has so many weapons and is capable of a massive alpha strike, it has tremendous heat dissipation issues, even just with its base weapon. So again, looking at baseline ACD, 132.9 points of damage across our 12-turn benchmark. When we tried to optimize this mech, we really couldn't get much more out of it. We were able to get it up to 139.9, so that's really less than about a 5% increase in overall output, and probably not worth the risk of taking on those heat penalties. And to me, really, I think that's indicative of anytime you see like large lasers in tandem and not enough heat sinks, like your riflemen, you see this all the time. You just can't use those weapons effectively. And then when you throw another PPC in the mix with only 20 heat sinks, it's like, why bother? And again, the red line ACD, 53.1, so damage absolutely tanks because you can stack those gunnery penalties so quickly. It built up 237 points of heat across 12 turns. And you can see it's basically up at the red line, almost starting at basically turn 5 or 6. It's up there, so pretty intense. All right, let's look at the lethality index on this mech. So again, this is a simulation. We've run this simulation 10,000 times. It's fighting a javelin, trying to kill it. Javelins are running around at top speed, just trying to survive as these mechs get closer and closer. So in this simulation, the Black Knight was still able to score 79.6% kills, right? So 79.6% of those simulations, it destroyed that javelin. Out of that 79%, 68.9% were CT kills. Only 10.7% were head kills. I mean, that's not terrible. So the sort of the 1 out of 7 being head kills there, or 1 out of 8 maybe. It does have the large lasers. It does have the PPC. So you are going to, it has big damage weapons. It has capability to, headhunt and things like that. Again, the issue being that heat. If you look at the groupings in the bottom left, you can see there are some turns where, there's not a whole lot being fired. Very rarely is it firing the PPC and both large lasers. In fact, only one turn it seems like that it's doing that in that optimized weapons grouping. So anyway, the point being, this mech can definitely core out mechs, can definitely get kills, but it does have a harder time getting those bigger weapons into play more consistently. So damage per hit, though, is still very good. 6.97 damage per hit, again, attributed to those big guns. But also it has 4 medium lasers, a small laser, so that's going to pull down the average just a little bit there. Scored about 4.5 critical hits per game. Not bad. Again, it does have a ton of weapons, and it is firing quite a bit, especially as you get closer. You're looking at 5, 6, 7 shots per turn coming out of this mech. That's a lot. And then the time to kill, so 12.4. That's actually not bad. Some of the best mechs are down around 7 on average or 8 on average, and again, those are like the best mechs in the game. So being around 12, not bad at all. And then looking at the bottom graph there, not much to show. You can see that this mech basically does most of its kills at closer range, and that sort of corresponds to what we see in our baseline damage output as well, right? I mean, this thing's really doing the bulk of the damage in close. So the first thing that jumps out at me on this defensive benchmark is the motive hits, 41.5%. That's extremely high. That means 41.5% of the games you play, you're going to see at least one motive hit on this mech, which, as you guys know, it affects your PSR, it affects your movement. As soon as this mech suffers 2 of those motive hits, or even 1 motive hit and a penalty from heat, you're losing your target mod, right? It's going from a +2 to a +1. You take any more and a little more heat, or you have to turn or go uphill, and you're basically not able to claim anything. So that's problematic, and that just sort of stacks and makes the mech a little easier to kill over time. So why is that the case? Well, if you look at the record sheet on this mech, the legs are packed, so it's got all the critical slots filled up there. So it's not an issue there. It really is strictly the leg armor, right? And we talked about this on the first screen. And when we look at the expected versus the actual, the yellow bar being the expected is around 75%, right? And the actual is at about 63%. So 63% of the total amount of armor you can fit on the leg is just too low for a mech like this, in my opinion. I would strip some off the arms. I would strip some off the rear. Maybe a little bit off those side torsos. Again, you don't have ammunition you need to protect on this mech. And maybe just put a few more pips in those legs. I mean, all it's going to take is probably 2 or 3 per leg to get it up, and you would see that number go down dramatically. And just to remind you guys, again, 10,000 simulations, so this wasn't like a random game that this, you know, just happened to get a lot of leg hits or whatever. I mean, this is 10,000 games being played. So, and I actually ran this 3 times, so I ran it 30,000 times, and it was very much the same, 41.3, 41.5. I think at one point it was like 41 even, but at the end of the day, you know, plus or minus a percent, that's where we're at. So definitely a problem on this mech. But, you know, overall survivability was still very good. So we're looking at total kills of 14.8%. So in our simulation against the Awesome was only able to take this mech down about 15% of the time. So that's solid. And again, no ammunition on board, so the only way you're going to kill this mech is basically by slagging your way through the side torsos and into the CT, or just coring them out, or getting a head kill. So, and you can kind of see here that this mech is very tough. If you look at the bottom right-hand graph, the cumulative survivability, I mean, you can see how many motive hits this thing is taking, and the kills really start to stack up around turn 10, turn 11, turn 12. So, I mean, if you could cure that motive problem, I bet you would see the survivability go up even more. And for a mech with only 11 tons of armor, 75% total coverage, that's really good in my opinion. So it just kind of reinforces how much you really need to protect your ammo when you have it, and how valuable these ammo-free mechs are in terms of just raw survivability. So let's talk about the efficiency metrics around this mech. So first, we'll talk about effectiveness. So again, effectiveness is basically our optimized damage times our survivability. We put that together and we get this benchmark. So this mech, again, very high survivability, 85.2%, really good. And so what we see here is the damage pulling away a little bit from the optimized, you know, only around turn 9 when the deaths again start to stack up a little bit. And only really noticeable around turn 11, turn 12 when this thing is at point blank, and incidentally where it's doing most of its damage. So again, baseline was at 132.9, our optimized was 139.9, our effective is 131.2. So not bad, it's about on par with your baseline. So again, it's like plus or minus 5%, you know, gain to optimized, then loss to effective. Really not terrible. So overall, it's an even keeled mech. You know, it really shows me that it's a dependable mech on the battlefield. Again, just the key here, and we talked about this earlier, that heat, you got to keep that under control. So how does this shake out in terms of efficiency? Well, actually very well. This is a 6.49, which is above average. Our average is 5, and you know, it's beating out mechs like the Zeus in terms of just what you're getting for per battle value, which is pretty good. So 6.49, very solid score. Definitely a mech you would want in your lance. Again, key is just keeping the heat under control. So let's talk about gunnery score sensitivity here. So this mech did not score particularly high here, 5.38. I've said this before, typically the more sensitive mechs are the ones that have more to bring to bear at longer ranges. As you get closer and closer, you know, it's again, those gunnery, those targeting mods, those gunnery mods, right, the range mods, your gator basically is going to be lower. And so because your gator's lower, you're not seeing as much of a gain. When you're at longer range, you know, being able to hit more, you know, bring damage to the table earlier, very critical. So because this mech is doing most of its damage, you know, within 7 inches or really within 6 inches, I mean, if you look at the effectiveness benchmark, again, just as a point of reference, you can kind of see the bulk of the damage. The most area under that curve is really turn 9 to turn 12. Obviously a little bit there in turn 7, a little spike there. But anyway, so at the end of the day, I mean, gunnery 2 is great. Even gunnery 3 would work probably fine on this mech, assuming you plan to close with it. If you want to play it in a fire support role, maybe or towards a higher gunnery, but you might not see a great return on investment there. So at the bottom, you can see that that stacked area chart showing us gunnery 0 through gunnery 4, gunnery 4 being the closer to white and the gunnery 0 being more of the darker blue there. Pretty incremental gains, from one to the other. You can see the area gets smaller and smaller as you go up, which means you're getting less of a delta, less of a gain at any rate. Gunnery 3, gunnery 2, that's kind of where I would play this mech. All right, so lastly, let's check out our role analysis. So a few key metrics just to rehash. Our optimized average calculated damage was 139.9 and change. Damage per hit, 6.97. Our survival rate was 85.2%. Movement was 4.6, no jump. Red line heat, really high, 237. Efficiency score was great at 6.49, and our sensitivity at 0.538. So how does that shake out on the report card? Offensively, we're at a 4 out of 5, so very strong there. Defensively, even better, 4.5 out of 5. So definitely above average for, I think, a mech of this size. Mobility, 2.0, that's about on point for this weight class. Control, again, heat, got to keep it under control here, 1.5 out of 5. So efficiency, 3.5 out of 5. We talked about that, above average. Let's talk about the threat for a minute, and then we'll dive into the role. So threat assessment looks like this. On the bottom, again, the dark area, the dark bars, if you will, is our alpha strike. That's if you hit with everything, just max damage, all your missiles hit, everything hits. What do you get, right? Just add up the damage on the record sheet. The red is where we do some math and we say, okay, so what's your gator for this particular weapon at this particular range? What's your chance to hit? We multiply it all out and you get that sort of, it looks a little different, right, than the total of damage. And then we have the threat ratio, which is a ratio of what you could possibly do, what you're likely to do, divided by, how much heat do you have to spend to do that. So obviously mechs that can do more damage but generate tons of heat, that ratio is going to be in line, with a mech that, has less weapons but generates less heat. So it's an interesting point of reference, right, to kind of understand where these mechs are strong and where they're, where they're a little weaker. So, at the end of the day here, when I look at this threat assessment line, it's fairly flat. There's a little bit of a peak at 10 inches and a dip at 9 inches. You're typically going to see that when you have a lot of large lasers and a lot of medium lasers, right? Because, the large lasers are going to be very efficient at 10 inches. That's at medium range. And then all of those medium lasers are going to come into play at 9 inches, which is long range. So it's going to pull your threat ratio down. You're generating a lot of heat. So that's expected. But if we kind of trended that out, right, and we sort of scrubbed it a little bit, it's a fairly flat damage curve. And I mean, this mech is basically effective across the board, right? It can do damage just about everywhere. It does get a little more lethal from an alpha strike perspective and an average calculated damage perspective at 6 inches. You can see that jump up quite a bit at 6 inches. And then at 9 inches, once those medium lasers come into play, obviously the alpha potential goes up quite a bit. So if I'm going to play this mech, I'm going to be gunning to get this thing in close, which is sort of counterintuitive from what you might think, right? It's got a PPC in too large. Seems like it could be a good fire support choice. It can play that role, but realistically, I think it's deadly in close as well. So the threat envelope of this mech, again, it's got that PPC mounted on the right arm, so that gives it a little bit more on the right side. It does have a medium laser on the left arm, so it can bring that around to bear. Most of its weaponry is torso mounted. The 2 mediums, 2 larges, and the small on the head. So again, that forward arc, very dangerous. So if you're playing this mech, you want to try to keep everybody in your front arc. Try not to let guys get in your side arc. On the left side at least, and if you're going to stay, if they are going to get in your left and you're at close range, don't forget you can always twist and punch them if they're back there annoying you. So that said, how do we play this mech on the battlefield? So the first place I would play this mech is on the front line. So this is a mech that I think has decent speed, decent enough, a 6-inch or 6-hex movement is decent enough to run in a vanguard type of role where it can, start the battle at 18 inches and it can finish the battle, at mid-range, or even if it needs to get in closer, all the way down to 1 inch, and still be very effective. So this mech basically can play the spectrum of ranges there very well. It's tough as nails, in my opinion. 85.2% is really good. So excellent choice for this frontline role. It can also play a second line role. So let's say you're running this guy in a lance with, my favorite example, right, the King Crab, or mechs like that, right, that have just brutal short-range weaponry. The Black Knight can definitely play a backfield role to start, let the other mechs get in and engage, and then you can kind of move in to clean up the trash or provide that second wave of fresh support. And if the Black Knight's left unchecked, it can do a lot of damage. Remember, it can take on that heat. Firing 2 larges and a PPC, you just have to cool off afterwards, but that's a nasty 26-point alpha strike. I mean, that can do a lot of damage. And then again, you can close that mech in, and it's got just a whole arsenal of weapons to bring to bear. And even late in the game, let's say you're down a couple of mechs, I mean, this mech is tough, right? So it can go in, it can get in a 2-on-1 if the other mechs are damaged, and come out on top, in my opinion, if the dice gods favor you, of course. And then lastly, fire support. So, I mentioned it a little bit earlier. It's not really like the best fire support choice. It doesn't have anything beyond 18 inches. So if you're going to spar with an archer or a catapult, you might lose that game. But it is very capable of playing a fire support role. You just have to be mindful of where you are, what range brackets you're in, how fast your opponent is. So, I think maybe play a fire support role if this Black Knight is one of the bigger mechs on the field. You can kind of sit it back, let your smaller mechs go in and skirmish and brawl, and you can just deliver crushing alpha strikes. But, again, not my first choice. If I'm going to play this mech, for me, first choice is definitely a frontline mech. Maybe a second line mech. Fire support, again, capable, but not my top choice for this mech. So that's that, guys. Wrap up another mech review here. I really hope you enjoyed it. Definitely would love to continue to hear all of your great thoughts and comments on this. If you have recommendations, don't hesitate to post them up for other mechs that you would like us to take a look at. But yeah, thanks again, and stay tuned for more. There's a lot coming from Death from Above Wargaming.